Welcome to Cross Section, conversations at the intersection of faith, news, and culture. We are excited to be on YouTube. Please subscribe to the Evangelical Alliance YouTube channel to never miss an episode.
Coming up in this week's episode, the team react to the fact that in 10 years' time, the population might have increased by 5 million. How, as Christians, can we be having conversations about immigration? Also, a Gen Z generation of faith and fascism. Listen to the team react to some stark new research about the beliefs of this generation. Enjoy the episode.
Well, hello and welcome back. We are in season 10. This is episode 2. It's the end of January. It's a Thursday when we're recording this. Sometimes that's relevant to the stories we are picking up on today. I'm joined by Danny and Alicia. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
Great. Hello. Great to be with you.
It's good to do it at the same time and see who goes in first. So that's wonderful to have you both. We are in 3 different locations. You'll be aware of that if you're watching us on YouTube, where you can see us, or listening along. We're just letting you know that we're 2 in London, 1 in Belfast, but in 2 different parts of London. And we are looking at 3 different stories today. We're going to be looking at assisted suicide. That has been in the news a lot because it's in the committee stage. We're going to be diving into that and just understanding the processes and what's happening, getting some insights and the inside track on that. And the big story we're looking at is immigration, both here in the UK, given some headline figures about where the population might be in a few years' time, and in the US, where the new president is taking fairly quick and decisive steps about that, and you may have your views on whether those are good or bad. And then we're going to be looking at Gen Z, or Gen Z, as some insist on calling it, because we are a UK-based podcast. Faith and fascism, a couple of really interesting surveys about what's going on with Gen Z, so we'll be rounding out on that story. But we are going to turn to assisted suicide, a topic we have covered on a number of occasions, but it has been in committee this week and lots of things happening, lots going on. Alicia, I'm going to come to you first, maybe for a little bit of an update on where we are and kind of what has changed even in the last few days.
Yeah, of course. So at the time of recording, we are on day 3 of committee stage evidence sessions, and it's been a full week. All 23 members of Parliament who've been assigned to scrutinise the bill are calling different experts from different fields, palliative care, medicine, as well as law and direct experience, whether from the disabled community or others, to give evidence around the terminally ill end of life bill. And so it's been incredibly, it's been somewhat of an echo chamber in the sense that Parliament has been engaged, but yet not many up to date with it. I found yesterday's evidence session incredibly powerful in terms of those who came forward to share. I've done a few kind of social media posts on the X account for the Evangelical Alliance, highlighting Chelsea Roth, who is a researcher and kind of founder of an organisation that supports women with eating disorders and looks at international jurisdictions where there are cases where women with eating disorders have been euthanized. And she presented that evidence yesterday quite powerfully before the committee. And equally, the one and only medic and doctor talking about the experience of people from ethnic minority communities and how palliative care discriminatorily and has different experiences for those within the community, and how she's hearing from the ground incredible fears that are taking place. So it's been a full 3 days of listening and engaging with that, and very much more to continue on that conversation.
Danny, I'm not sure if you've been watching maybe as closely, but obviously it has. One of the things I certainly observe is really got picked up in the press a lot more. Radio 4, an interesting series on body politic, not necessarily agreeing with all, but really interesting conversation around not just assisted suicide, but also abortion and a number of key topics. A lot more coverage in the newspapers, I think, around this committee stage, and a bit more pushback going on of how this process has been run.
Yeah, it's unusual for a parliamentary committee to get this much attention, but then this is an unusual bill and an unusual process for such a bill. I've not been watching it intently. I've been catching up with Nikki DaCosta on X. If you don't follow her, she is the person to get the lowdown of the minutiae of who said what, which MP questioned which witness in what way. And it is... The idea is that these are expert witnesses coming to help this committee of MPs look at what the bill is proposing to do and whether it will do it, what the impact of that would be. They've heard from international witnesses from places where assisted suicide or euthanasia is in the law. Some of those witnesses were pushing the UK to have a wider definition, to change some of the judicial safeguards. Should it be 12 months instead of 6 months? Do you need judicial sign-off of it? Can you do that in a different way? So all of these issues have been discussed. And I think in the next phase, in the coming weeks, this committee will consider amendments to this. And it will be interesting to see whether there is an appetite for changing the proposals and whether those changes are just superficial or do they significantly change what is being proposed, and whether that changes MPs' attitudes towards this bill.
Yeah, and we can see amendments from both sides. So I think one of the things being discussed in the last day or two was a panel of experts. So a number of judges, Lord Sumption was there. There has been evidence from the former High Court Judge James Mumbrey about the impact on the courts. It's simply not feasible to have High Court judges sitting and hearing these cases without significantly extending the bench. I think it would use up almost the entire High Court family division capacity to hear these cases based on some of the numbers. So you're seeing suggestions that would change, and so in one sense a loosening of some of the restrictions, and there'll be others presumably tabling amendments. And I think Ben Spencer is a doctor who's one of the people looking to tighten, if you like, some of the criteria around this. And already I think there's one MP, I'm not sure if they're on the record, have been indicating that they said, I voted on the basis of this set of safeguards and a good process, and what I'm seeing is not that. And so there is definite possibility of people shifting their minds, changing their opinions. Danny, you stole one thing I was going to say. Nicky DaCosta is definitely the person to follow on X or Twitter if you want the kind of nerdy level of information. Former Director of Legislative Affairs in Number 10, and is really very insightful on the process and what's happening. I also saw a clip of Baroness Faulkner, who heads the Human Rights Commission. And again, just trying to point out that this process was unusual. It didn't have some of the normal impact assessments and kind of safeguards. And Kim Leadbeater was very quick to try and kind of shut her down, as she has done with quite a number of witnesses. And this theme has been picked up. She is not happy with anybody who challenges any part of her process. And the chair's had to intervene, it seems, on the clips that I've seen quite a number of times around this. Alicia, any further comment, and then also where we're going next? So we're 3 days in, I think you're saying. There's amendments coming. For those who want a little bit more detail, what's the next steps on this private member bill process?
Yeah, of course. I think the first thing, just to follow up with your Baroness Faulkner's input about the process and somewhat of Kim Leadbeater's pushback. What's interesting is, as I mentioned in my address, it's somewhat of an echo chamber in the sense that this is the news and the focal points for those 23 MPs. But in terms of Parliament as a whole, there isn't much engagement with wider MPs on the substance and the details of the bill and the evidence session. And I think that's going to be a huge part for those who are opposed to the bill coming, both in principle, but also advocating on its impact to the elderly, to those with disability, to those from ethnic minority and poor communities that will be impacted on that it's the responsibility of us to continue to inform our MPs. So I guess the next step from a parliamentary process is that once this kind of evidence session concludes, there will be deliberation amongst the 23 MPs going through what amendments will they take and consider. And already it's been noted that the High Court judge decision is an alarming point, because at the point of second reading, that was the safeguard. So to reduce that to a panel of judges is already sparking alarm in the media space and those that are engaged on this. And then from us at the Evangelical Alliance, we will definitely be resourcing and equipping members to engage with their local MP ahead of kind of that report stage, which is expected on the 25th of April. So there's still some time in terms of this process and engaging with it.
Yeah, and it's our real conviction that we're encouraging people to pray into this space. We have a deep policy objection to this. We just think it's wrong in principle. We are pointing out some process questions that we've always had too, and you can find more resources on the eauk.org website around this, around mainly to do with that first stage, if you like. But as and when things come, as Alicia said, we will keep you updated, and we will keep coming back to the story because we think it is actually pivotally important in terms of what it reflects on a cultural shift, and it could be one of the biggest changes, I think, certainly in a 10 to 15 year horizon in terms of the substance of what it does. Speaking to friends who minister in Canada, where I trained, a minister there, just this is always on the table as a topic of conversation for anybody towards the end of life. It fundamentally changes the engagement in every conversation approaching death, because up close to 5% of deaths in Canada are now through assisted suicide. So, look, it's one we'll return to, but we're going to move on. We're going to move to immigration. Big story, both across the water, and we'll maybe come to that in a minute. That's as in the US. But UK population is set to grow by 5 million within 10 years, and net migration levels could be the highest in Europe for the first time. And basically, the sole driver of population growth in the UK is now immigration, essentially because we're not having enough kids to grow and repeat, to kind of enlarge our population, if you like, in that way. And so 72.5 million is the predicted figure by 2032. The other implications of that is we're going to be an older population, an increasing number of pensioners, because we're not having enough kids just to replace the population. Alicia, this is a big headline-grabbing story, and what the government does about this and how we as Christians engage in this is probably what we want to focus on.
Absolutely. How do we as Christians even engage on the topic of immigration? Thinking back to our report that we published just before the general election, thinking faithfully about politics, immigration was ranked as number 20 out of 24 issues for which the local church was talking about. And yet, if we're thinking, the reality is evident within communities in terms of whether that's the gig economy, the hospitality, whether that's through kind of racial marriages, whether that's to do with the NHS, public services, immigration impacts us all. And so I thought it'd be really great to kind of start this conversation about what are our principles when we engage on the topic of immigration. Is it led by our political, theological dispensations? And for me, if I'm being honest, over the last kind of 10 years, I would say it would be driven by my political affiliations in terms of how I engage on this issue. But most recently, a close friend was challenging me, actually, what does Scripture speak of about immigration? It speaks often about caring for the foreigner, which is 100% where many is a foundation principle for those that engage in refugee and asylum. But equally, there are real realities that our immigration system is equally being exploited. If you're in the health and social care sector and you're on a visa for which has either run out and you're not, that person is engaged in the immigration process, then there's a real reality that you could be exploited through zero contract hours or poor pay, poor working environments. And so the headline figure speaks of a population increase. And I think in our current culture, there is a lot of fear around that and legitimate concerns about housing, public services, and so on and so forth. But I want to kind of think about, personally as a Christian, how do I engage in this, and what are our Christian principles when we engage on this topic? And it's not as easy as you're right, I'm wrong, and I dismiss that. And I feel it's one of these topics, if we go back to Brexit, was very much a dividing issue within local churches because there was different political points of view of how to work out biblical convictions on what is a very difficult topic. So not providing an answer, but providing a framework of how do we engage on this going forward, and the challenge of how much is our faith shaping our values on this issue.
I think it's a fascinating issue, and I think it's one that really does cut into a few key questions for Christians in terms of how we think about the society we live in. I think the imperative to care for people and to provide support for the foreigner, for the stranger, for the exile is there in Scripture. And I think actually in terms of Christians' engagement with this issue is often where we start. Actually, how are we providing support for people who are fleeing for their lives, but for whatever reason are seeking sanctuary? And I think that's a really important component of it. I think the challenge for Christians is, how do we think beyond that? And how do we think about what are the implications of a changing society? How are we thinking beyond welcoming people in because actually, yes, they're coming into our country because they need protection or they need somewhere safe. And that's particularly in the question of people seeking asylum or who are refugees. But what is the impact? I think people sometimes have concerns about the change in communities, how that affects different parts of the country in different ways. People who live in inner city contexts that are very multicultural already will be used to it. People who live in other areas may not be. One of the added components of this is 5 million extra people. That's the population of Scotland, nearly. That is a significant increase in the UK population. We are looking that the UK government have already said they want to build 2 million new homes over the next 5 years. That would be swallowed up by this increase. How is that compatible with other plans? Something I read was asking the question of people who support immigration generally want the government to reduce their carbon emissions. Actually, building houses is a significant contribution to carbon emissions. How do these things all add up? How are we changing? How is immigration changing the communities we live in? And how do we as the church respond to that? I think the church hasn't always worked out how it thinks. And I'm talking about the church in a generalized sense, which isn't always helpful. I think we look at immigration as something that has massively benefited the evangelical church in the UK. It is often ethnic minority churches that are growing and that are having a hugely positive impact on our communities. So I think sometimes we've been caught in this situation where sometimes some aspects of it we really like and we think are really important, and other aspects we're less sure about, which has meant we haven't had a consistent way of speaking around immigration. And again, I'm offering no answers, but just posing more problems.
A lot more questions. Yeah, well, I mean, it was typified for me even in this thing we mentioned briefly last week, which was the bishop and the president and that exchange. Again, it was like my feed was the split that we mentioned of some people saying this was absolutely brilliant from this bishop. Finally, somebody spoke truth to power. This was a prophetic moment. She was prepared to call the president out, particularly on migration and on trans kids. And then the other half saying this is an incredibly liberal bishop who pushed out any conservative Anglicans in her area. I met another bishop this week who was telling me around that piece and was very frustrated that that wasn't being covered. This was an interfaith service with a very strange array of things as part of that worship service, and then showed no mercy and no engagement and no relational. It was just a moment to kind of get up in your hobby horse and have a go at the president, knowing the world media were there. And so there was very few people seem to navigate anything in the middle around that. And again, it seems like that when you come to this issue, it's either hospitality and welcome, and that's it on the one side, or some form of justice and fairness and the importance of the local kind of bounded family, extended family on the other. And it is difficult to navigate, even between the language you were talking about it, Danny, asylum, refugee, migrant, economic migrant. People are moving for different reasons. How important are those reasons? And the kind of society we're welcoming them into, a multicultural society. There seems to be a lot of reflecting back on how healthy that was. How much does the host nation say, actually, our language and our culture are important and our values? There must be some engagement in that. If you're coming here, how much do we want much more intercultural and mixed? And we're seeing that in the church. Israel, who leads our One People Commission, a lot more about what's an intercultural church look like. Even as church communities, it's not quite the same as the States, but we definitely do have divisions around different ways of worshipping, and therefore people gather around those styles, and those can lead to gathering around ethnic kind of lines. And then we see second generation, more engagement, some diversity amongst that, and different churches trying to straddle that. But it's not easy, and there definitely are challenges. So, Alicia, we've all asked lots of questions. We've all asked why it's so divisive. Tell us a little bit about what perhaps we're doing as EA, what's coming up, and what, even in a policy engagement, because it's not fair to say answer all those questions. But, before we turn to Mr. Trump to finish out this section.
Well, it's important to start this conversation because the government are due to release their white paper, which is kind of their position on migration going forward, which will address some of the kind of underlying challenges that we face in this country in terms of what should net migration be annually. Possibly could be a conversation that they explore. What should be the new asylum and refugee system moving forward, both in processing those who have come to seek asylum, those who have not been accepted. How are they going to be removed? Because the Rwanda plan is no more since the Labour government came into be, and tackling some of the real issues of if this is a Labour government of growth, and so far for the last 10 plus years the economy has been built on immigration, how are you going to confront some of those real realities whereby it impacts the hospitality, gig economy, and kind of NHS and social care if you're limiting how many immigrate those from overseas coming into work in the workforce? So these are going to be very difficult conversations. And once that white paper is published, I look forward to educating and speaking with our members about it.
And one of the things we're interested in is, like, some people maybe think we're a bit too focused on the States at times, but the reality is what is happening there does have an impact. We talked about the vibe shift last week. Donald Trump has promised the biggest deportation in US history. There are aspects of the vibe shift that I personally think are interesting. A return around families linking to this conversation. One of the reasons is that immigration has been a factor economically is that we're having, what is it, 1.7 kids? I'm not sure the exact number, but we're not replicating. Most European populations are dwindling and diminishing, and so they can't raise a sustainable workforce. And of course, everybody knows that pensioners, they're not living off the money that they set aside in the past. It's the current generation keep funding the one ahead, and so there are big challenges from that point of view. And the vibe shift, I think, around family and some of those areas, the return to reality and accepting reality, I think are encouraging. The bits that concern me are this kind of slightly macho aspect to it at times, and aspects like this where it's just, let's do deportation, let's just push everybody out. And you see the way Donald Trump's doing in the US is causing considerable angst because of the speed and the way in which it's being done. The language around that concerns people. And so we do look to the States from time to time just to see what's happening. Selena Gomez, the actress, was breaking down in tears over Trump's deportations. We've seen fairly high-profile stories around that. Danny, anything we need to be careful of as we look to the States before we wrap up on immigration?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that funding has been removed from organisations that provide support for refugees. That's impacted a number of evangelical Christian ministries in the US that provide that refugee support. But I think we talked about the Overton window last week. I think the swift action and the way that Donald Trump has engaged in this, rounding up people, closing borders, removing funding, has shifted that conversation to, what could a slightly different approach be in the longer term? What does a more restrictive policy look like? Even within Trump's inner circle, there's been disagreement over actually where does the US benefit from immigration, particularly in the high-tech industries. Elon Musk, one of his closest confidants, it would seem, would support some people coming into the UK, into the US, in the high-tech industries to benefit those places, but not support immigration in other places. So what kind of immigration we want is as much a question as to whether we want immigration. And I think how we engage in some of those conversations will be crucial, because it's not just a simple binary yes or no. And then it's, well, actually, what are the criteria and the parameters that we want to put on immigration and that we should or should not put on immigration? And I think there's a lot there to reflect and think about.
You're listening to Cross Section. You can get in touch with us at cross.section@eauk.org. We'd like to shamelessly plug a few things in this moment. We have Relationship Matters resources out. So if you go to eauk.org/sexuality, you will find a whole range of hopefully really helpful resources for your church or organisation. Somebody mentioned Rwanda, so I'll shamelessly plug that I will not be with you all next week because I'll be cycling in Rwanda for Fields of Life. If you will follow my socials, if you want to find out what's going on and who I'm raising money for and why I'm doing that for 8 days. But please do get in touch on all the socials with any comments or questions. You can be watching on YouTube. You can be listening wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love you to like, share, review, and let others know. That would be incredibly helpful. And we'd love you to tell us what we're doing wrong, what we should be talking about, why you love Danny or Alicia or whoever it is, and who should be dropped from this show next, and why we should get Zana back. Whatever, let us know. cross.section@eauk.org as we come in to land on our final story. Gen Z, faith and fascism. Why are we talking about that? Well, two pieces of research are out there. One that says Gen Z are significantly less likely to describe themselves as atheist. Now, that's not a simple good news story for us as Christians, but there's definitely more interest in spirituality, not in established religion. But also 52%, I hope I'm going to get this right, I'm going to check my notes to get this, of 13 to 27-year-olds said that they thought the UK would be a better place if a strong leader was in charge who does not have to bother with parliament or elections. A benevolent dictatorship. Yes, Danny thinks that's what I run in the EA, but anyway, let's keep going. So 52%, I mean, that's a staggering number, particularly of Gen Z. So 13 to 27-year-olds who think UK would be better with a strong leader who didn't have to bother with elections. They would get things done.
The same survey said that 47%, just under half, said that the entire way our society is organised must be radically changed through revolution, which is higher than some of the older age groups. And it is fascinating. And it is it's counterintuitive, because generally the approach is that people are more liberal in their youth and become more conservative as they get older. That's the general view. Maybe actually what happens is people moderate their views as they grow older. Maybe this is just youthful frustration or naivety as to seeing something else. But I think it does demonstrate a deep frustration and distrust in how politics operates, and the fact that our institutions and political systems don't seem to serve people in the way that they want them to. I think there's a real wake-up call, particularly around the appeal of strong leaders, of wanting the army to take control, of not bothering with democracy or elections. Yeah, it's a bit of a wake-up call.
It's the rise of the strong man, and it's the Überman, and I said that the Übermensch, a strong leader, but that's Nietzsche's Übermensch. I think that, and it was talked about when Trump came around the first time, and this time in particular, he did get a growing number of voters from a younger age demographic. I think predominantly male, but not exclusively. We have seen other polling said there's a gap opening between younger females and younger males in their political kind of allegiances and persuasions. This is part of a Channel 4 report that is only coming out actually today as we launch the fullness of it, so we don't have all the data and information behind it, but some of the headlines are certainly intriguing. Alicia, you're arguably closest to Gen Z in this gang. It's a good gang for you to hang with. So there's two surveys, of course, one on the authoritarianism and a number of other questions, and one on faith. What were your thoughts as you saw these?
I think alarm, particularly the democracy point, or rather greater affiliation to authoritarianism. I was at the Holocaust Memorial Day event within Whitehall this week. And similarly, another statistic came out saying that Gen Z's kind of understanding or appreciation of both what the Holocaust was and the liberation of Auschwitz, that they're more likely to have anti-Semitic views. And I don't want to write off a whole generation, because clearly that is not a whole generation. But what it shows is that the power of social media and technology to inform their discourse, because that is their primary source of information. It's online media, and they're being drawn to very strong, appearingly strong male individuals. I think the report speaks of the likes of Jordan Peterson, as well as Andrew Tate, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and what I would say, whilst these men are very different, what they share is a sense of they're breaking away from the status quo and asserting themselves as quite a strong figure. And I think there's an important role for Christians of all generations to articulate both the meekness and strength of Christ as the ultimate example of what it is to be a strong individual, and particularly to younger males, what strength looks like, that isn't domineering, overbearing, toxic at its core, and suppressive. But it also reveals this disparity between the sexes, where you have a situation where young men believe that, women's rights, equality issues has gone too far. And I think that speaks to the toxic nature around the debate. In many ways, they have been forgotten. There are many men that are struggling, many men suicidal ideation that are not getting the support, depression, mental health, all these things where a lot of services are not geared and provided for or spoken about for men. And I think it's the role of the church to speak into that space, that God cares about both men and women. I think in the sense of faith, we've spoken about it on this platform before, there is a heightened spirituality amongst Gen Z, and I would say within the culture, because what we're seeing before us, who provides answers to the mess of both domestic and global affairs, and in many ways, the atheist movement has left many unanswered questions, and so they're looking to a higher power without accountability. And again, it's an opportunity for the church to really lean into that and be explicit that it's not just God, but his name is Jesus, and we need to articulate that both to the needs of insecurity and doubt, and to speak about the life that is in him. So I think they're great opportunities for the church, if we're alive to it, to really speak into a younger generation and demonstrate intergenerational ministry and kind of mission and community together.
Yeah, one of the other responses was younger respondents are more likely to consider social media as a trusted form of news than mainstream media. But there's a great deal of uncertainty about who and what to trust. So that shift in the news sources is, again, a vibe shift thing. We've seen it. We can see all the numbers and the stats. There are no real centrally agreed news sources anymore. The BBC is probably still top of the pile, but not dominant in the way it was. And so many young people, and so many people in general, are getting their news out of social media, and they're getting a very particular set of stories. And the reality is, I think all media has an agenda. We've got to recognise that, but I am fascinated by that. And it's one of the reasons that people are on social media. So something like The Way I find really interesting, and how they engage in that generation. So it's if you're on Instagram or something like that, it's really interesting to watch how they're opening up space in public conversations with younger Christians, and doing that, I think, in a really healthy and interesting way, because that faith stat is a consistent one. We've seen a number of surveys now saying this generation is more interested in faith. If they accept Christianity, they're more passionate about it. It's more embedded to them. There's not a cultural Christianity. There's no kudos to that. There's no benefit. They're not going to do it. So if they are in, they're properly in and committed. And so there's a number of, I think, actually quite encouraging stats. But the challenge I would give perhaps to some of our older listeners is, I was out on tour with church leaders the last couple of days in Northern Ireland, but we've been in other places. And I was asking them particularly about the Joe Rogan podcast that we talked about last week in West Huff. Less than 10% had heard of it or listened to it. It's like, well, then don't complain about young, particularly men, but people not being in your church if you're not engaging what I still think is the biggest, cultural apologetic moment. Certainly this year, but I would say over the last 10 years. If you're not aware of these things, then that's on you. We've got to be engaged. We can't sit and complain around the edges. So I think interesting stuff is happening. I think Rogan and others are opening those spaces. We've said it before, and I'm going to keep saying the discipleship journey, or the flip of that, is they're either being discipled kind of almost live in real time. Look at somebody like Russell Brand. And again, I'm not making a comment on any of these individuals, but what's happening, you see them processing stuff in ways I'm going, that's problematic. I think you'd be better to go offline for a while. But some people like to watch almost this unfolding. Ian Hershey Ali and Niall Ferguson, you've got Louise Perry, you've got Joe Rogan on a journey, you've got Jordan Peterson. A lot of these people doing it very live and in ways in which don't maybe conform to an orthodox understanding of Christianity yet, but being discipled into that. And young people are engaging. Every young person I've talked to, has either watched that or is aware of that Joe Rogan podcast, including lots of females, so it's not exclusively males, and I am fascinated where it goes. I'm going to give you each a last comment on this, and then we're going to wrap this show up. Danny, you're looking eager to come in.
Oh no, I think I was just thinking about the male-female shift and how people engage. I think churches have often been aware that women outnumber men in the church, and yet we're seeing a situation where men are, particularly young men, are becoming more attracted into church. I think that is great. I think it presents challenges. I think churches need to be aware of both the opportunities in terms of the gospel and the openness to something more spiritual that we would hope that they would find in Jesus, but then also be ready to engage with people, to disciple them, to provide a space for them to grow, so that it is not Jordan Peterson, Russell Brand, Andrew Tate, other online people providing that discipleship to them, but instead actually the church is doing that. So I think there's an opportunity and there's this challenge for the church to step up and say, okay, well, this is a new context, this is a different environment, and it will ask something new of us in how we respond.
Yeah, I think my input as a disgruntled millennial is that I need to get better at being discipled from those older than me, but equally being more intentional in discipling those who are younger than me, and not within like a 5-year, but even younger. And I think the challenge for the church is we have to be curious about the world in which a younger generation is growing up in. I think 2025 is the year of beta, isn't that? Babies are now going to be beta. What's their world going to look like? If you're not a parent, how do you invest? How do you disciple? How do you continue to speak eternal truths into cultural challenges that this next generation will face? And we're only going to know that when we're bothered to step into spaces and engage with some of the content that they're listening to and find those kind of gospel hooks and redirections to Jesus. So yeah, got to break out of our echo chambers.
Absolutely. Look, it's not without its challenges, but there are incredible opportunities. You've got Gen Z saying, look, they're facing growing uncertainty about who or what to trust. I would say that applies across all generations. We are less clear who and what to trust because we're getting, again, so much information coming at us from so many different sources, and it is difficult to filter that and to make an assessment. And yet, in one sense, some of this is not new. When Jesus is responding to Pilate and he's asking about that, are you the king? He says, you say I'm a king. Jesus replies, in fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And then Pilate classically says, what is truth? And that question just continues to resonate, that kind of what is truth question. And again, a new generation are asking that in a new way. Some of the responses are going to look really interesting. You listen to Joe Rogan and Wes Huff, and it's 3 hours long, and 2 hours of it is like really detailed Old Testament textual analysis, things that I thought are... I mean, I wasn't that interested, and I mean, I studied this stuff.
Peter, you got to read the Old Testament. Great section.
I love the Old Testament, but I married an Old Testament scholar so that she can explain to me what it means. But the last hour is fascinating, and that question he keeps asking, essentially, who do you say Jesus is what he asks Rogan. The Huff asks Rogan, and kind of keeps pushing in an exceptional human being. But yeah, is it more than that? Is he the Son of God? And in a time when people are asking who and what can they trust, it's incumbent upon us as a church to be trustworthy, and we have let ourselves down at times in that. We absolutely need to acknowledge that and put our hands up and say that the church has fallen short, but we also need to do better and to be trustworthy, and not to exaggerate, blow our own trumpets, or just get things just tragically wrong as we have done in the past. So I think there's an incredible opportunity, but I don't say that naively without recognising the challenges of the very conversations we've had around immigration, around assisted suicide, and some of the things that are going on out there. But each of those in their way is a moment to engage. So we hope we're helpfully resourcing you to have those conversations as we have them very often live, and are processing them too in real time as things are coming. This is Cross Section, where we're trying to help you navigate faith and culture in this moment. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us. Be blessed.
Hi, Alicia here. Thank you for checking out this episode. If you like it, please make sure to subscribe or share with a friend and leave a review. Till the next episode, take care and God bless.